All right, Sean, are you ready to introduce our presenters?
Absolutely. So today we're excited to have the maintainers, and you'll be hearing from Jessica Meyerson, Andrew Russell, and Lee Vinsel. I'll allow them to introduce themselves, and they can come off camera and come off mute, and we'll go off camera and go on mute.
Right on. Thanks, guys. Thanks so much for having us. So Andy, Jess, and I are going to talk about the maintainers group we run that tries to draw attention to the importance and value of maintenance and repair and the ordinary work that keeps the world going. So I guess we can start quickly by doing little self-introductions. So I'm Lee Vinsel. I'm an assistant professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech, and one of the co-directors of the maintainers. Jess, you want to go up next?
Hello, everyone. Yes, absolutely. Seconding Lee's comments there. Warmest thanks to Cameron, Sean, Joel, Josh, all the board members of Chai Hack Night, and all the participants of the Chai Hack community. My name is Jessica Meyerson, as Lee said, and I'm currently the Director for Research and Strategy at a nonprofit called Educopia Institute, and one of the co-directors of the Maintainers, along with Lee and Andy.
Hi, everybody. My name is Andy Russell. I'm the third co-director of the Maintainers. I live in Utica, New York, where I'm a professor of history. I do history of technology, like Lee does, and I'm the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at SUNY Polytechnic Institute here in sunny Utica. Thrilled to be here. Thanks.
Right on. So tonight we're going to introduce you to some of the ideas of the Maintainers, this group we help run. And I always like to start Maintainers talks by letting people know that 6 years ago, the Maintainers started out literally as a joke. So Andy and I had been criticizing the idea of maintenance, or the idea of innovation, sorry, as it was kind of talked about in tech circles and higher education. And then our ideas really started coming together when the book, The Innovators by Walter Isaacson came out. So it was called The Innovators: How a Group of Hackers, Geniuses, and Geeks Created the Digital Revolution. And Andy proposed to me and a buddy that we create a kind of counter volume, which we called The Maintainers: How Bureaucrats, Standards Engineers, and Introverts Create Technologies That Kind of Work Most of the Time. And we started playing around with that on Twitter and blogs, and it just kind of took off and kind of gathered steam and kind of got a life of its own. And then a little while later, we wrote an essay called Hail the Maintainers and held our first conference. And then it really went viral and kind of got picked up by The Atlantic and Guardian, Le Monde. Eventually, there was like a New York Times op-ed and a book and other things. So I like to tell people that because, first of all, it's not like we planned to start this thing together. It was just kind of happenstance. And second of all, I think that that joke about the Maintainers is really kind of a guiding force for how we think about things. So tonight, briefly, I'm going to talk about our notion we call innovation speak versus actual innovation, and our critique of innovation speak. Andy's going to talk about ideas of maintenance and maintainers, and then Jess is going to talk about what we've been doing with the Maintainers and as a community and organization, and kind of how we think about moving forward. So we like to make a distinction between actual innovation, which is the process of introducing new things into society, and innovation speak, which is how we've come to talk and think about these things basically in the post-World War II period. And our point, first of all, is that these two things are not the same. In fact, since the Industrial Revolution took off, 150 or 200 years ago, there was a lot of innovation in that 200-year period. But the word innovation really only takes off after World War II, with the steepest period being the 60s and the 90s. And really, if you look at Google Ngram, which is a tool you can throw words in to see usage patterns, it really doesn't stop going up until even last year. It's just like a constant upward curve from after World War II to the present. We're talking about innovation more and more, but that doesn't mean we're getting more and more innovation. So in the book and in other places, Andy, Jess, and I really try to lay out why people glommed onto that idea. And a lot of it has to do with economic growth and ideas of progress that became tied to technological change, or what became known eventually as innovation. And I just want to kind of lay out things in the most general terms. We can point you to places where we really go deep into this history of why we came to talk about innovation. But we argue in various places that there's costs of innovation speak. And I'm going to kind of enumerate certain costs that have come with it. Again, to be clear, one of the reasons we want to make this distinction between actual innovation and innovation speak is because we're not opposed to innovation, actual innovation. Actual innovation can be good or bad. It's not necessarily a benefit, as we'll see, but innovation speak is what we're arguing as a problem. And here's some of the things that why it's a cost, why it's a problem for us. So first of all, it doesn't necessarily get what we want, which is more innovation a lot of times. So there's an argument by Robert Gordon and other economists that innovation, actual innovation, was faster in the period from 1870 to 1970 than it has been since 1970. And yet we're talking about innovation more and more from that period of 1970 to the present. So there's some kind of mismatch between innovation speak and the generation of new actual innovation. The second thing is that it often leads us to introduce things that aren't necessarily really great. So, in pieces we've written, we've talked about that Samsung phone that was bursting into flames, and how it was cast as an innovation by Samsung before it turned out to be this nightmare. We used to make a joke that, you don't want to apply the idea of move fast and break things to bridges, but then we stopped making that joke because a university in Miami actually created this kind of fast building bridge, and then it collapsed and killed people. So this notion of innovation is sometimes applied and applied in places it shouldn't be, and leads us to do things that aren't that great. The third thing is that chasing innovation often leads organizations to do all kinds of bad things themselves. In the book I wrote with Andy, we list all kinds of examples from higher education, but there's also lots of examples from business. For instance, we highlight General Electric, which tried to remake itself as a software company, and then 2 years after it announced it was going to do this, its stock was in the garbage. So chasing innovation often leads organizations awry. The fourth thing is that we come in our culture to treat innovation like it's a good or value in itself. Like we say innovation, we just assume that it means good. But according to really strict economic definitions of innovation, crack cocaine was a major innovation in the 1980s and 1990s, even though it was destroying neighborhoods. It was innovation. It was a new thing that people wanted. And there was, risky entrepreneurship around it called drug dealing. So this is an innovation, but it's not a social good. And you can make the same kind of argument around things like the opioid epidemic, terrorism. All these things can be cast as innovations, but that doesn't mean they're a benefit. And yet we've come to treat them as if it's a good in itself. And the fifth thing that's wrong with innovation speak is that in organizations, in our personal lives, in government, it leads us to neglect other important activities that are really essential to our lives and to organizations, including maintenance. And that's where I'm going to hand it off to Andy.
Thanks, Lee. So it's good to take a minute and think about what maintenance is, what its definition is, and what it means to you. And so I can start by telling you the dictionary definition. Maintenance is the preservation of existing order. And you can imagine that happening in your daily life, in infrastructure and software and so on. A different way to think about it is that maintenance is the perpetual fight against entropy. Things just naturally fly apart, and maintenance is the effort to try and bring them closer together, to keep them closer together. And so thinking about maintenance in this kind of broad definitional way helps us make the transition from what Lee was talking about how an overemphasis on innovation can lead to a lot of problems, and to a kind of positive steps forward about, okay, we understand there's a problem. It's a big, complex problem. How can we go about fixing it? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how maintenance operates and how we conceptualize it. along 3 distinct levels. The first is infrastructure, the like biggest societal possible level. The second is the meso level, think about organizations. And the third level is the micro level, that is all of us as individuals. So I'm going to talk about those 3 levels, and then I'm going to describe 3 aspects of what we call the maintenance mindset, which we can apply to any of these levels and more. Okay, so maintainers are the people who do the work, right? Maintainers are the people who preserve order. If you think of occupations from software, nursing, cleaning physical plants, like janitors or custodians, and so on. They're in every conceivable industry, and they're in every conceivable culture. And so at the first broadest level, I want to talk about infrastructure for a minute, and the attention to maintenance that needs to take place in infrastructure. Okay, so you're probably familiar with the America's Infrastructure Report Card, which is always like has terrible grades for different levels of American infrastructure, like bridges or roads or education. So the US usually gets a D+ in that. And a lot of it is due to maintenance or disrepair. And so one area that we're really encouraged to see, and there's kind of buzz about it on the list and in op-eds, is a greater push for investment in infrastructure maintenance, like highways and bridges are the ones people always talk about, but the human infrastructure as well. So that's the broadest level. The second is about organizations, and Lee talked about higher ed. It's a little bit painful for us in higher ed to think about how much money we spend chasing the new thing instead of taking care of kind of the most important core things, but we're not going to get into that too much. But you can imagine an aspect of a university, like a maintenance university or a maintenance college, where people are paying adequate wages to all the faculty. People are making sure that the workload for students is balanced, that there's enough student support. You can imagine a world like that if we prioritize maintenance. So, we could talk about private companies as well, but that's the meso level. For individuals, when we talk about this, we talk about it in 2 different ways. One is in our personal lives. So what is it to think about maintenance in your house? During the pandemic, it's been a little too easy, I think, to see little bits of, carpet that need to be cleaned, or paint that needs to be done, or shelves that need to be built. So there's keeping up with things around the house, and we're familiar with that with our possessions as well, whether it's phones or cars. Also with individuals, one thing to really think about when you're thinking about maintenance is, why do we put entrepreneurs and certain professions like software engineers on a pedestal and ignore what we're now thinking of as essential workers? How come people get steered into one profession but not the other? So these are just some things I wanted to try and jog some ideas in everyone to think about the benefits of maintenance and how it operates at those 3 levels. So the second thing I want to talk about just real quick is the maintenance mindset, because here's some, hopefully some tools to help you think with maintenance and how to advance the cause of maintenance in different spheres. So there's 3 principles that I want to talk about here. The first is that maintenance sustains success. Okay, this is what I think of as the just get with the facts side of things. You got to get your information together, whether you're thinking about open source software where things need to be updated regularly, or bugs need to be attended to. From that small scale to large scale, I mean, think about what organization theorists call high reliability organizations, Netflix, Amazon, aircraft, chemical plants, so on and so forth. So all of these people know that maintenance sustains success. Sometimes the trickiest part is articulating that in dollars and cents. So maintenance sustains success. The second aspect that I want to touch on is that maintenance depends on culture and management. to get a group of people to really take maintenance on as a core value, they need to get over this hump of, oh, it's not sexy, you know, or it's not the sassiest, latest, most interesting thing. But really what maintenance does, it's not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. So if that end for your group or your organization or your country are things like equity or sustainability or just keeping things running, those are matters usually of culture and management. People in the industry, they say some of these things aren't tricky technologically. You know, there's great software that helps companies, for example. It's a matter of implementation and use with those things. It's kind of getting in the details. So maintenance sustains success. Maintenance depends on culture and management. And the third point about the maintenance mindset that I want to leave you with is that maintenance requires constant care. So there's no fix it and forget it, you know, like the old commercial said. It's a habit. And there are things like books and checklists, and I mentioned software that helps individuals or organizations kind of make it part of their routines. It's nicely aligned in that respect with some other groups that we spend time with. Like this group is a great example, but also the Right to Repair movement, where repair cafes and fix-it clinics, even during COVID, are kind of an exercise in community building. It's not just the technology, it's the community. Okay, so over to Jess. Maintenance mindset. Maintenance sustains success. Maintenance depends on culture and management, and maintenance requires constant care. Jessica, you want to talk about what we're doing?
Yes, thank you so much, Lee and Andy. And if I may, I'm just going to share a few slides with everyone. Let me present. I'm going to move through this really quick because these might just be useful reminders. And I provided these questions to the organizers of the event in case somebody wants to use some of these questions as potential breakout prompts. It might be fun to hear back from all of you about what you think about this. And so by asking many individuals, as the interviews that Lee and Andy conducted for the book, The Innovation Delusion, and what we do as an organization in engaging and moving from individual experience as a maintainer to movement building, just kind of covering this ground. These are some standard prompts we start with, and then we start to identify commonalities and differences across individual experiences and spheres of maintenance, like the ones that Andy just mentioned. So again, there are many really rich anecdotes in the Innovation Delusion, including Tom the maintainer. And so you see that this is really the story of an individual's experience being underappreciated or undercompensated. And then what we're currently working on is how we take all this, what we might call anecdata or individual experiences and stories that people have shared, and start to translate that or maybe operationalize that into movement building, community activity, and ultimately change making. So one of the things we're engaged in, we kind of have three main activity areas right now. One is called maintenance communities. And the idea behind this is to identify core groups of people that sort of have a sphere of maintenance in common, even if they don't have the same profession or the same professional identity. So an example, one of our primary and most active maintenance community at the moment, the information maintainers, this is their mission statement, and then these are their values. They value access, embodiment, intergenerationality, and translation. And they meet once a month, very similar to Chai Hack Night. And there are two co-coordinators working on that. And so what the goal of the maintenance community ideas is to help to facilitate and provide some basic scaffolding, some platforms, some visibility, some promotional effort around these conversations that are specific to those different spheres, and then work with those different groups to elicit insights, potential interventions that are in those different spheres of maintenance, but then also at that 40,000 foot view or kind of a braided conversation, figure out how we can sort of refine or elaborate on what Andy described as the core tenets of the maintenance mindset based on what's emerging in common out of all of these different kind of more specific discussions. Another key area outside of maintenance communities is sponsored research or our research direction. So the maintainers started and still is a research network. Not everyone holds a faculty position or a formal research position within an institution of higher ed. There are many applied researchers, there are policy advocates and researchers in the group. There are many different professional hats worn by individuals across the network. But it did start out with a set of like questions and engagement along the lines of journalists and different researchers thinking about maintenance, repair, and feminist ethics of care. And so with our research agenda, as we've articulated it, we look to ground discussions about human relationships to technology, and you can find this on our website, themaintainers.org, and also start to measure and document the actual impacts of valuing or devaluing maintenance, right? This goes back to there's a real resonance, and people have definitely felt that maintenance applies in their personal and professional lives. However, it would be great to have some more targeted data that helps maybe to drive policy change or other kinds of intervention. So a few example projects within that research area of activity, looking at the psychology of maintenance, and this pings back to Lee and Andy, I think both alluded to these existing biases around certain professions that tend to be more maintenance oriented, or at least by perception, as opposed to innovation oriented, even though we know very well that in the process of maintaining and keeping things in repair, you're coming up with solutions all of the time, innovative solutions all of the time, or what Lee referred to as actual innovation as opposed to innovation speak. Essential data about essential work, and this is a shout out to our close partners and colleagues at United for ALICE, which ALICE stands for Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed, or what has been referred to in the past as the working poor. And they do studies based on data from like the Bureau of Labor Statistics in each state. So they combine it with state level and regional level data to really look at the difference between how decisions are made around resource allocation at the policy level with our existing poverty index that was created back in the first half of the 20th century versus what a real survival budget looks like in the 21st century for a household, which is their unit of interest. Highly recommend checking out their reports. They have them for numerous states. And then a third project that we've been working on with the maintenance community that I mentioned, looking at how do we understand what essential information maintenance work looks like, both within and beyond the pandemic, since many of those positions in cultural heritage institutions are typically embodied in person, co-located. And a lot of those workflows and just ways of conceptualizing of that work have had to be reconceptualized of in a work from home environment. And the third area, y'all will appreciate this, maintaining the maintainers, right? So this is what we call Maintainer Central. And this is everything listed here. So growing capacity as a group to do more and respond to the interests and priorities of our community members. We've been doing that we just had our inaugural meeting of our advisory board where we sort of worked to bring together a group of people with very different professional sort of areas of expertise and experience, but definitely complements to what we all bring to the table and what our community members bring to the table. So we're looking forward to driving the movement alongside all of them, as well as our amazing program coordinator, Lauren DePina-Fraze, who I believe is currently watching the live stream. So huge shout out to Lauren. We're so grateful for you. And then as part of building that capacity, that's allowed us to streamline things like processes and workflows, look more closely at strategic partnerships, like what is actually going to help us drive the mission in what order. Events like these are a big part of Maintainer Central programming in general. So we typically do shorter virtual events, like the Information Maintainers hosts a call once per month that's recorded and has invited speakers similar to this format. We've also done Maintainer Central events where we tried to bring together different voices, different perspectives on the same topic topic within the broader field of maintenance and repair. And then we've had 3 annual summits or conferences at this point. Lee and Andy mentioned these, the first 2, 2017, and I believe 2016 and 2017, and then more recently Maintainers 3, which was in Washington, D.C. in 2019. So we're currently thinking about our next big event, and we'd love to hear from this community about what would make that meaningful for you. And there's a call to action coming soon. So here we go. Join the Maintainers listserv if you haven't already. We actually put out things for community review and feedback. We just put out what's called the Maintenance Community Framework to ask all of our community members to help us think about where to focus, which spheres of maintenance to potentially focus on, and what might be some different formats for convening maintenance communities. You can also sign up for our maintenance community listservs, which you can find under the community section of our website. They also post prompts and discussions and feedback and event registration links. Register and attend our virtual and in-person, maybe one day, events. And then maybe think about collaborating on an event or bringing maintenance to the events that y'all are already doing. Like, what would maintaining civic tech look like? And then also, if you join the lists, we would love to have y'all's feedback on this maintenance community framework document, because that will guide our work, similar to the community feedback exercise that this group did 2 weeks ago. We're really looking to that feedback to guide our work moving forward on these other aspects of our programmatic activities. So that's a little bit of what we're up to, and huge thanks to all of you for having us this evening.
All right. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm really excited to get towards questions. And before we do that, I'll just share that this is one of those frameworks that you find, and then it helps to explain a lot of different things. So for me, we have this conversation going on about how do we maintain democracy, or how do we maintain a health system that works well, or how do we maintain our emotional well-being in a hard time. There's these threads that are really fascinating, but I'll turn it over to Sean and see if he'd like to ask the first question.
Yeah, sure. We had a lot of good, excuse me, we had a lot of good questions from our audience. And so I'll just kind of read one of them now. So we have, in the book, you mention how there are incentives for local governments to buy something new with no money or realistic plan to maintain it. How can we demand more realistic project from our leaders?
Yeah, so here we're drawing on, especially on the work of Strong Towns, which is an organization that tries to make municipalities financially strong and resilient, and the work of Chuck Marone, who's the head of Strong Towns. But the way that Marone explains it is that U.S. infrastructure policy works in this way. The federal government's willing to give localities and states money to build infrastructure, but then those places are agreeing to maintain it in perpetuity, right? And there's often no tax base. In most situations, there's no tax base for all of the kind of infrastructural debt that these places have built up. And so, I mean, I think there's 2 ways. There's big changes we could make, like forcing municipalities to change their accounting practices, so they actually have to put their kind of infrastructural debts in the form of debts when they account for all the debts they have. That's not how we do things right now. So we could push for changes like that. The other thing I think is just getting involved, and this goes to like what you guys are up to and your members are trying to do, is get involved with the local decision making and trying to focus on, like, well, what do we really need, this big new road that's going to become another problem when all these places we have already got have potholes in them and such. So I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, just to tag or double down on the local part. I think because we're talking about incremental changes in the long term, coming up with one big master plan to save it all isn't going to happen. So it really needs to happen to inculcate habits and routines, like Lee said, on the local level. So it's going to, city council meetings or school board meetings, making yourself a nuisance, or forming alliances with people who do, that sort of stuff.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I'll ask the next question here. So the next question is there any relation of this to TRIZ, theory of innovation, problem solving? So for those who are watching who might not know about TRIZ, this is a problem solving framework that suggests that we know a little bit about how we've solved problems in other circumstances. So let's abstract that and use those problem solving principles in other places. That's a very brief and hastily put together description, but another framework for problem solving. So curious how that relates. That's the question.
Annie, Jess, what do you think?
I hadn't
Well,
come
yeah,
across
I
it.
just-
Go ahead,
Oh,
Jess.
sorry.
No,
Yeah, no, Cameron, great question. I just quickly Googled theory of inventive problem solving and just trying to see like what some of these parallels might be. And I can see like one of the key of the three main ideas is that innovation need not be random and it need not always be a new idea, which I think gets back to Lee's articulation of actual innovation in contrast to innovation speak. So there may be some deeper parallels there, but I can see that pop out almost immediately.
Thank you. And of course, if there was a more specific aspect of that question, I'm sure that they can, or they're welcome to put the follow-up in the chat. But Sean, you want to move to the next question?
Definitely. Another audience question. Framing of maintenance and service of existing order might imply opposition to changes towards things like undoing past harm or achieving greater equity. And then they just wanted to know if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the danger of that definition of maintenance, is that it does imply a kind of conservatism in, in all kinds of sentences, including political senses. So first of all, I just want to say that's not what we're trying to say. And all three of us are like, your typical progressive academic types. And I think that we also, Andy and I end the book by talking about two examples, which are racial inequality in the United States and climate change, right? So both of those things, if we're going to be real about racial equality and climate change, are going to require a lot of change in our culture, right? And even if we just want to talk about technology, we can talk about the kind of new, we can talk about renewables when it comes to climate change, all kinds of new technologies we need to put out there. When we talk about racial equality, we can talk about how we need to change our infrastructure, because like poor Black neighborhoods are really poorly served by our infrastructure and public transit very often and stuff like that, right? But I think that the point we try to make, even if we were to make these systems like more environmentally friendly and just, right, those new systems we build are still going to require maintenance. Right? And so when we think about racial inequality in the United States, we think about public housing and how disproportionately in cities like Black people live in public housing. These places are terribly maintained, right? And if you think about like elevators in these places, there's all these famous articles in Chicago and New York and all these places about how their elevators are out of service for months and stuff. So the way we have like deal with racial equality, very often maintenance is part of the problem, and it also needs to be part of the solution. So that's kind of how we think about it. It's not like we don't want change around important issues. That we definitely do want that, but we also want to think about how maintenance needs to play a role in that story as well.
And I don't know if this is helpful, but just to build on Lee's points and kind of provide some alternative places where we've addressed this explicit question. So through the maintenance communities, the information maintainers published a white paper called Information Maintenance, a Practice of Care, which may be of interest, and I've provided the Zenodo link to your organizers. But key in that, and really front loaded, is the acknowledgement of exactly this. So the idea that, you know, infrastructure is only invisible on breakdown. And that reality means that the people maintaining those infrastructures are also invisible, and that invisibility becomes circular. So it stems from established power dynamics and inbuilt biases and assumptions that lead to poorly constructed infrastructures that further oppress and marginalize. So these are just some other articulations of many of the ideas that sort of Lee just laid out in terms of how we talk about exactly that. So yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking.
All right, I'm checking the document to see. So I'll ask the next question here. Curious about so as far as research, as a research network, there was a description of how there's these small innovations, actual innovations in the process of maintaining. Can you speak a little bit more to how that shows up, either in the research or beyond? Some of the examples of those types of actual innovations.
Innovations in maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Andy, you want to talk about that?
Sure. So, so what management in the practice of maintenance looks like now is very different than 100 years ago. Today, there's all kinds of tools, including AI and predictive analytics is really the big thing today. Married with sensors on all different kinds of physical equipment. So predictive maintenance is not where things started. You know, at first, maintenance, the professionalization of maintenance was just about keeping things from failing, and the professionalization aspect was sharing information about that. So it's preventative maintenance. Eventually, it came along. So yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about this in the book, but there's certainly been improvements along the way. And you also see it in products too, where the majority of corporate effort when we think about research and development, a lot of the interesting innovations happen in development. So it's not the creation of a brand new product. It's how to make that product, like a cellular phone, more usable. And that takes teams of people. You know, it's a huge enterprise. So that incremental approach, I think, is something else I heard in your question that might be kind of useful to think about as well. How these come together.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sean, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear. This isn't related to my question, but it's interesting to hear about the incremental approach, because you hear about like agile workflows, and you hear like some of these more terms and project management terms that, particularly, like, at least anecdotally, a lot of startups are using, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which you would also think, like, again, anecdotally, these are probably the people who are going to be using this innovation language the most. So it's just kind of interesting. My question is, like, you've done a good job laying out like the ethical benefits and the ethical reasons for maintaining. And I can imagine, as you've worked with different stakeholders, whether it's a different government or different company, or just kind of ask questions of them, you've also probably gotten questions related to, like, okay, like, I understand why I should maintain this, but what's the economic benefit or the financial benefit for our organization or government? And how have you handled those discussions?
Yeah, Andy wrote about this in the book, so I'm going to turn it over to him again.
I'm not sure exactly what part you're thinking about, but I mean, what I usually start with, just it being personal, you know. I mean, you think about those 3 levels, like at the biggest Actually, the biggest picture, it's kind of easy to think about how the neglect of repair and maintenance on things like bridges will lead them to collapse. But on the personal level, everybody experiences this all the time. So the reason I don't eat Oreos for breakfast anymore is because I learned it's not good for me, and to maintain, my body and my health, I really shouldn't do that. Same for the car. I mean, why do we change the oil in the car, or all those sorts of things. So, stretch.
I was thinking about profit numbers though. Remember like the return on investment numbers? That's what I was thinking.
Oh, yeah. So professionals have access to all kinds of information about this. And it's actually the software vendors who are the best sources of information, because they're trying to sell you a product for maintenance management. And there's like triple digit return on investments that they can show down to an individual piece of equipment, like a pump maintenance contract that costs $5,000. The cost of catastrophic failure is $350,000 for replacement parts, downtime, materials, labor, all that kind of stuff. So they've got tons of examples on that. That's just industry specific. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and you see the same thing in like, Amazon Web Services and Netflix are like geniuses at maintenance because they're competing on uptime, right? So like they know quality of service has to be like the thing they're focusing on.
But the big issue, like you said, is how to communicate that to people, and how to communicate that within an organization. And that's when the maintenance professionals get together, they commiserate about how challenging that is, Yeah.
Again, it's striking how much these paradigms just pervade society. Ounce of prevention, but I digress. So I'll ask the next question here. So the next question is, in the US and probably elsewhere, we see many really important jobs that maintain vital things, but the jobs don't pay as well. And also our culture doesn't think of as cool. Who does it better?
Yeah, the who does it better question, first of all, I think is a deep question. And, we point to examples in the book like Dutch water maintenance, water system maintenance. Like the Dutch have to keep water out of their country, so they're pretty good at it, right? The Japanese are extremely good at maintaining their high-speed rails. So I think we can look at like really cultures of really good maintenance. But I think ultimately, like that's a tough question. It's the kind of thing, I mean, we could bring Jess in just talk about like research programs and stuff, because I think we on that kind of comparative question, we need to go deeper. But I lost my train of thought. Andy, I'll kick it over to you. Or Jess.
Yeah, Jess, I think is.
Yeah, Jess, go for it.
Yeah, so, and this is just to say like who does it better? I mean, yeah, as far as our research program is concerned, one of the things we want to do is we not only want to understand nationally or internationally comparatively, like which countries have models that might be translatable in some form or fashion into our national context, but I want to track back to a couple of other things, which is one of the assumptions that we make that Lee and Andy have mentioned several times, and in longer talks about this model of how you move from individual experiences to building a movement, we kind of call it the inside out approach is one way that we term it. And to go to the example of strong towns that Lee brought up, there's this focus on local consciousness building and local awareness building with people on issues that they are intimately familiar with, and that they can ground down this broad and inclusive topic, this resonant topic, into their daily lives and practices. And so there is that national comparison, but what we're trying to do is get somewhere in between this like very granular piece, which is what we know and we enjoy talking to lots of individuals and groups about, and this like high national comparative gestalt, like who does it better question, which is a good question. We have lots to learn from other national models, but get to maybe the organization or the community as a vehicle for change, somewhere in the middle of that. And so again, for the research directions, what we're trying to, and maintenance communities, what we're trying to do with the maintenance communities is look and see, are there sectors or are there spheres of maintenance that have real insights into how to make these rhetorical arguments, these convincing arguments to leadership and resource allocators about this. And then also, to do some of that comparison, potentially nationally. You know, we've been talking to some of our colleagues in other national contexts like France and the Netherlands about how they conceptualize of this culturally and where they see opportunities for intervention. So I think it's an ongoing conversation and a really good question. So I'll just second what Lee said, which is it's deep and it's wide, and we're looking forward to digging in deeper and wider to that point.
Thank you for sharing that. Sean, is it okay if I jump in with one sort of related question here?
Oh yeah, totally. Go for it.
Okay. So I think we have time for about two or so questions. So I see we have one on deck, but I wanted to ask a question about nature seems to be pretty good at maintaining stuff at maybe at a different time scale. I'm curious how ideas of maintenance maybe relate to the natural or biological world. So some things that come to mind for me are just like the homeostasis, just the imperative for living organisms. I'm wondering if there's any like fertile research directions towards that or insights.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Cameron's idea. Yeah, it's a great question. One thing I'll say, Cameron, not to that level of specificity. So to mirror your question back, are there models in the natural world of sort of meeting equilibrium and maintenance over time of ecosystems or, you know, whatever the case may be, and an individual plant or organism, whatever it is? That's really cool. And I appreciate you bringing that up. I would say one of the things we have talked about that's at a higher level is related to the maintenance communities. So some of the spheres of maintenance that we've been talking and thinking about, and remember before when I said that those spheres of maintenance, it's not a one-for-one, like this is about the environment, and so everyone in this maintenance community is going to be an environmental activist or someone that works in environmental education. There are many professional hats that can be worn within that environmental maintenance space. So that is something we've been talking about, which is what would it look like to have kind of an environment grounded maintenance community and see what surfaces out of that. So great question, Cameron, and great idea. I love that as a research direction.
Thank you for your answer, and I'll turn it over to Sean for the next question.
Yeah, I think this is probably our last question of the night. That's our last audience question. So good timing, everybody. This person wanted to know if you've looked at trends with certain philanthropy organizations. I'm assuming this is somewhat anecdotal, noticing that like a lot of grants are provided for organizations that are trying to push out new ideas, rather than just trying to keep, maintain essentially their current work or the community that they're serving.
Yeah, we all three of us have lots to say about this. I mean, a lot of our friends work in foundations, and we've gotten support from the Sloan Foundation and the Siegel Family Endowment grant money. And they're all like, all the people in the, there's many people in the kind of foundation world at this point who've kind of gotten into the maintainers idea. They all know it's a problem. It's just like, it's so obvious that it's an issue in that world that they fund these new things. Then the question is, how do you sustain it for the long haul? You can see it in civic tech. You can see it in the digital humanities. You start up all these new projects. You got a new app. You got a new thing. But then, how is it going to be maintained over the long haul? And it's just such an obvious problem in the foundation world. It's so true. Andy and Jess, you have things to add? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, seconding Lee's points, and then also going back to one of the community members' questions about equity and maintaining systems of oppression and things like that. So one of the grant making trends that you see, so a couple of things that I'm drawing this from, aside from Lee's point, that we engage with some grant makers in our conversations and in collaboration. there's something called the Collective Impact Convening, and it happens every year. And it's a bunch of organizations that are focused on lots of different issues, anywhere from like food deserts in different cities and counties to education K through 12 and trying to drive graduation rates. I mean, it's really across the map in terms of mission-driven organizations. And within that program every year, one of the groups that often presents are grant makers themselves, talking about new models for thinking about philanthropy in general. And so drawing from the 2020 May convening, for example, this particular presentation was making a lot of these points directly from some foundation representatives. And I can send the organizers the link to the presentation, but the bottom line being that if you want to have equitable grant making, if you don't want to keep funding the same organizations over and over again, you have to ask yourself, why are you doing that? Because that is a hedged risk. So if I fund, you know, such and such private university well endowed over and over again, why is that? That may be in part based on a calculation that whatever we spin up, to Lee's point, that institution has the means to maintain it over time themselves, right? Whereas if you fund smaller organizations, it might be calculated as a slightly higher risk, or maybe less well-established organizations, because it might be calculated as a slightly higher risk because, again, where are those resources guaranteed that they're going to be able to continue that work in perpetuity? But the switch is not only that I think that the maintenance message has definitely caught on in some of those circles, but this idea of equitable grant making is something that I think that profession, that sector is starting to do a lot of kind of introspective work on. So I think that those two dovetail quite nicely. And yeah, thanks again for asking that question. I think it's a terrific question.
Awesome. This has been a really awesome hour. And so thank you again to all of you for your presentation and discussion, and thank you to our audience for their questions. I believe that's all the time we have for today. Cameron, do you have anything else that I might be missing?
I just wanted to make sure we got to the comment about disability. Did
I miss one?
I'll get to it. I just want to mention it before. So there was a comment just about in the case of disability, maintaining the old could help a lot, i.e. sidewalks, but maintaining an old inaccessible station would perpetuate a problem.
Yeah, I think Andy and I talk exactly about this in the epilogue to the book, and it's a really good example. First of all, there's actually pretty good stuff written about the role of maintenance in the lives of disabled people, which often requires a lot of work, and there's a lot of interesting stuff. But that's exactly right. We can't maintain these subway systems and L systems that are inaccessible. That's just not just. So that's an obvious example where you need to change. Thank you for that.
All right.
Thanks for catching that, Cameron.
Thank you, John. All right, so I'll close this out here. Thank you once again.
Yeah, thanks for having us, y'all.
Yeah, this was so much fun. Thank you so much to the whole community and the organizers.
All right, and we'll be sure to share out the resources that were shared through our Slack channel. Thank you, Sean, wonderful co-host. Is there anything else that you wanted to add here before we send folks over to the post-show Zoom call?
No, just thank you, Cameron. Good job, everybody all around. Thank you, audience, for staying tuned. And again, there's the link to the post-Zoom call. I know you can't click on it, but you can definitely remember what it is and type it in, or type it in right now. Also, if you're on Slack, there'll be a link in our Chi-Hack Night Slack channel. But I think that's it.
All right, and you can go
forth and hack.
All right. Thanks, y'all.
Yeah.
Thank you.